What are the virtues of unilateral free trade? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners as always.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. And if you're brand new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for some 34 years of principled arguments in favor of the libertarian philosophy, which is really the greatest philosophy that's ever been discovered or invented or people have come up with. Richard, last week we talked about the case for open immigration. Now we call it the case for open borders, but mostly it revolved around immigration, the free movements of people across borders. I think this week I want to focus in on the flip side of that, and that is the free movements of goods and services across borders. In other words, what we generally call in the libertarian movement, libertarian philosophy, free trade. And let me begin by just talking about the virtues of trade, because we've talked about how libertarianism, it really is the key to ending poverty in previous shows, in the sense that people accumulate wealth and they put the part of their money into banks in the form of savings. The savings are loaned out to their employers to buy tools and equipment that make the workers more productive. And then that leads to higher revenues, which lead to higher wage rates through the virtues of labor competition. This is one of the real attractive aspects of libertarianism. It really did discover the key to ending poverty. People sometimes say, what are the causes of poverty? Well, as Adam Smith asked, in 1776 in his book, An Inquiry into the Nature of Causes, the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, is what are the causes of wealth? And what I just outlined is one of those causes of wealth. When people are free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, it leads to capital accumulation, which makes more people more productive. But the corollary to that is free trade. And we often forget that people can increase their standard of living through the simple act of exchange. That because they're always giving up something they value less to get something they value more. So in every exchange, in every trade, both sides are benefit. Both sides are increasing their standard of living. So if you have 10 oranges and I have 10 apples, and we exchange 5 for 5, we both increase our standard of living. Otherwise, we would not have entered into the trade. We better our position. Or if, let's say, you give up 8 oranges and I only give you 5 apples, we've still increased our standard of living, both of us, because we've given up something we value less for something we value more. So obviously, the principle is that the more opportunities you have for trade, the more opportunities you have for increasing your standard of living. You may live in a society where there's no factories, there's no automobile manufacturers, for example, and you can increase your standard of living just by trading with people. So the corollary to this is that to the extent that government interferes with people's ability to trade, either domestically or internationally, to that extent, it's lowering people's standard of living than it would have been absent those interventions. So when we talk about trade wars, it's clear that when there's a trade war and there's impositions and tariffs and restrictions being placed, say, on the ability of people to buy from, let's say, China or Russia or whoever the official enemy of the day happens to be, to that same extent, they're lowering the standard of living of the American people. So it's not just an attack on foreigners with these trade wars, it's an attack on the American people themselves. It's lowering their standard of living. The same thing with sanctions and embargoes, that these things prohibit the Americans on pain of criminal prosecution, of civil forfeiture, civil suits, damages, that the government's going to come after you if you, for example, violate the restrictions on trading with Iran. If you buy some Persian rugs and import them into the United States with plans to sell them to people and thereby increase their standard of living, because if people want Persian rugs, that's making them happy. It's increasing their standard of living. If you do that, the government will come after you. And so there's been this freezing of trade with respect to Persian rugs or anything else from Iran, which lowers the standard of living of the American people. And then my final example of this is the embargo against Cuba. You know, it's tempting to think, oh, well, this is just an attack on the Cuban people, which it is. I mean, it's designed to impoverish the Cuban people, just like the sanctions are with Iran and China and Russia and everyone else that there's sanctions. The target is to impoverish them in the hopes that they will rise up in a revolution and oust their dictator and put in a pro-US dictator. But what Americans often forget is that, like the embargo against Cuba, is an attack on our freedom and our well-being here at home. That if you go to Cuba and you spend money there without permission, in other words, you enter into trades with people buying things, the federal government will prosecute you on your return. They will arrest you. They will convict you. They will very likely put you in jail for a year or two, and they'll fine you because you have violated their little sacred embargo. But to that extent, the standard of living of the American people is dropped too, with the inability to buy things from Cuba. And whenever there's a restriction on trade, there's going to be a lower standard of living simply because it is interfering with the ability to better their condition by entering into trades with others. So what is the real libertarian solution to this is, well, you can negotiate the trade agreements with people, but that's not really free trade. Like when we had that NAFTA agreement where they said, oh, this is a free trade agreement. Yeah, it consisted of about 4 inches of rules and regulations. You don't need to do that. All you need to do as a nation is drop all your own government restrictions on trade. You don't need to negotiate anything. If other nations have restrictions on trade, that's their business. Okay, it's not a good thing. But what we need to do in this country is lead the way and just dismantle all restrictions on trade, domestic and foreign, and then watch the standard of living of people soar. What do you think?
Well, let me sort of deal with a few of the common arguments that are raised against freedom of trade. One of the most common is that, well, if we buy foreign goods, and by underselling them, this costs American jobs. Jobs will be gained in the foreign country, but those gains are at the loss of American jobs of making those comparable products in the United States. And therefore, it is certainly a zero-sum game. The job gains in the foreign country are at the expense of job losses in the United States. But this is a very short-sighted view. Let us suppose that you have been buying a domestic version of some desired product for $10. And now there's a foreign supplier who has the capacity. He's more cost efficient. He's found ways to reduce transportation costs to bring it from his country to our country. He's found ways to be more cost efficient. And now he can offer that same product that we've been buying from our domestic producer for $10 and offering that to us for $5. Now, what is the outcome of this? Well, first of all, it is true the domestic producer will lose sales. We're now buying the foreign version rather than our home country domestic version. But as Frederick Bastiat used to say, there's the difference between what is seen and what is unseen. Well, what is unseen? Well, first of all, it means that the American consumer who was spending $10 now gets the same product for $5. This leaves in his pocket $5 more than had existed before to do what? Increase his demands for other things that he'd like to buy, which he had not been able to buy before because his money couldn't go as far. That means that there will be an increase, most likely, for some domestic product that previously he couldn't afford. So there will be an increased demand for some alternative product that the American consumer now has the money to spend on, given he's buying the foreign version less expensively of the other product. That will increase the job opportunities in that alternative sector of the economy. So part of the workers let off in the in the domestic product that is no longer able to face as effectively the foreign competition, shift into making some alternative American product that previously could not be afforded to be produced. So on net, no jobs are necessarily lost that way. There's the further thing, if I can add to this, Jacob, and that is that if a foreign seller now sells us this product for $5, we have to ask why. Because he considered it profitable from his point of view, given his own greater cost efficiencies than his American competitor, to sell here. He wants to earn $5. And what does he want to use that $5 for? Well, he can use that $5 in only a handful of ways. He can turn around and use the $5 that he's earned by selling an American consumer his foreign product, and then using the $5 to buy some American export that he wants to buy. And therefore, there's an increased demand for what an American exporter can produce and sell abroad, given that this foreign recipient of the $5 now has the financial wherewithal to purchase that wasn't there before. And that means some alternative jobs are created there. But in all of this, the standard of living of Americans has increased. Why? Because the $10 product is now bought for $5. And the extra $5 is now enabling him to demand things that previously he couldn't afford to, and therefore freeing up resources to make other things that now raise his and other people's standards of living and improve the circumstances of the foreigner who now has the financial wherewithal to buy an American export that previously he couldn't afford. Everything is a win-win situation in this way. And this just hammers away the second point that I'd like to make about this. And this is the idea that, but what if there's a balance of trade deficit from this? What if the foreigner doesn't spend all that he's earned? This is the big brouhaha that someone like that many politicians make and special interest groups. But let's just look at it a little more closely. Okay, let us suppose that Americans buy $1,000 worth of some goods from a foreign set of suppliers. Just let's pick two countries, the United States and Japan, for instance. So we buy $1,000 worth of Japanese goods. We have the goods, which obviously we valued more highly than the $1,000 we've paid for them. And the Japanese manufacturers, the sellers, have earned $1,000. Well, why do they want these $1,000? To have the financial wherewithal to buy things that money can buy. Now, they might want to turn around and buy a whole array of American products that, from their point of view, are more attractive or less expensive than buying their own home Japanese versions of them. Let's suppose that they spend, out of the $1,000 they've earned, $800, Jacob. Well, that's usually the point at which the American import critic gets at. We spent 1,000. They've only spent 800. See, somehow they've taken advantage of us, Jacob. Let's take a breath. Let's take a breath. What else can they do with the dollars that they've earned? There's only a whole handful of ways, assuming they don't want to just use the dollars they've earned or part of it to wallpaper their houses. Let's suppose that they find it attractive to directly invest in the United States. Now, direct investment just means taking part of the income you've earned, not spending it on consumer goods, setting it aside as savings, and using that savings to start a business, expand a business, partner into some other going concern so that you're a direct investor. So let's suppose they spend $100 of those out of the 1,000 they've earned on a direct investment. What do? They either rent or buy a land from an American, and part of that $100 goes as income to the land seller or the land renter. Then they spend part of that $100 in hiring an American construction company to build a factory. And then, having paid that American contractor to build the factory, they then pay other Americans to basically house and construct and then house most of the machinery, equipment, and tools that they need, their capital equipment, to undertake an investment. And then so part of the $100 have gone back to Americans in that way. And then finally, most of the people employed in that factory will be American workers. And part of the $100 now continues to be spent in the United States as salaries. So there's workers to work with the machinery in the factory they built on the land that they've either rented or purchased. So now we're talking about 800 and 900. Well, what else could they do with the remaining now $100? Well, let's suppose they found it attractive to invest $75 of that remaining 100 out of the thousand in indirect investment. What is indirect investment? That is merely like when you or I decide not to spend all the income we've earned and we put it in a financial institution, a bank, and our savings and the savings of multitudes of others are then funneled out to credit-worthy borrowers through the intermediary that we hire, the bank official who does the credit worthiness application evaluations of people who want to borrow. He funnels our savings out and the savings of others to investors, mainly American investors. And therefore, to the extent that they've saved that $75 out of the thousand they've earned and put it in an American financial institution, they've increased the savings pool out of which American investors can have greater resources to produce more goods and services in the United States. Now, 800 on American goods and services, $100 on direct investment, $75 as indirect investment in housing that money in a financial institution for, at the end of the day, the same reason you and I do it. Put money aside for some future use and to be earning interest in the meantime so that that sum set aside grows in amount and wealth. But what about the remaining $25? Well, it could be that one of the Japanese earners of dollars decides that he wants to buy not an American good, but a product in Europe. Now, in Europe now, many of the countries have a common currency, the euro. You don't buy European goods with dollars directly, very rarely. You need to use their currency, the euro. So that person holding the $25 in Japan will go into the foreign exchange market and he will exchange dollars for a certain quantity of euros. How many dollars for the euros? Well, that depends on, like all supply and demand, the price of the day. Now, who will have sold euros to that Japanese earner of those $25? Someone who wants the dollars instead of the euros they're selling. And what will that person want that $25 for? To buy American finished goods, directly invest in the US economy, or perhaps because of the attractiveness of American interest rates, put that money in an American financial institution to collect interest income in the future the way you and I do. And guess what? 800 plus 100 plus 75 plus 25 equals what? 1,000. At the end of the day, the balance of trade balances. If you add up all the things that need to be on both sides of the ledger book, your debits, your credits, your expenditures, and your receipts, it balances. So this is just a total fallacy that somehow trade can be one-sided or advantageous to one country as opposed to the other. And if I can just use one more example of the logic of this, Jacob, because this too comes up. Oh, a country like China or some other international rival of us, they subsidize their industries. And that may enables their domestic producers to be able to sell a product in a foreign country like the United States for less than their actual costs of production. Well, that may be true, but let's think about this. Let's suppose that some Chinese manufacturer has the capacity to sell a product for a lower price in the United States because, given his cost of manufacturing, part of those expenses are covered by a subsidy transferred to him from the Chinese government. We get that product for less. We're economizing our money. We now have the greater financial wherewithal, like in the first case I talked about, to have dollars to spend in other directions that we couldn't before. Whether it's subsidized by a foreign government or whether it's due to an actual market-based cost efficiency that lowers expenses of manufacturing, we still benefit from that. Who should be complaining? The Chinese taxpayer, the Chinese consumer. Why? It's his income that has been taxed to transfer the subsidy to the Chinese manufacturer who's being subsidized to sell something abroad for less than his actual cost of manufacturing involved. And that means he has less money that he's earned in his pocket to buy goods and services that he's desired. Who should be complaining? The Chinese taxpayer and consumer. Who is benefiting from this? We're getting a gift. We're getting a gift. It's like a product falling from the sky and we have to pay a price for it less than would be the case. So at the end of the day, even if it is subsidized by the foreign government, it doesn't matter. Because let us suppose that that Chinese manufacturer was not receiving the subsidy and he was actually lowering his cost of manufacturing. Then what would be the problem? There is no problem. In terms of the real situation in the market, the product is available for less in the US and frees up American resources and the satisfaction of American demands in other ways that previously couldn't be afforded and capable of being undertaken. And it's the Chinese income earner, taxpayer, consumer who bears the burden of this. And he should be complaining, not us who receive the benefit of that misguided government interventionist policy.
All right. Well, but let me tell you what I'm worried about based on what you just said, because I worry about the imbalance of trade between Virginia and Florida. Now this is really serious, Richard, that I don't know the statistics on it, but I'm just speculating that there's a lot more money that Virginians are spending in Florida, especially in the wintertime, than Floridians are spending over here. I mean, there's Disney World, there's the snowbirds, and there's going down there just to have a nice time in the sun. Now there's tourist sites over here, there's Mount Vernon and so forth, but I suspect that Virginians are spending a lot more in Florida than Florida is spending over here. And I'm pacing the floors every night. I can't sleep over this imbalance of trade because, I mean, this could mean that all the money in Virginia is slowly going to get funneled into Florida. We're gonna like fall into the ocean or something here. But Richard, people don't worry about this. Notice that the balance of trade argument does not even fit into the equation in people's conversations with respect to the states. I mean, these are individual sovereigns. It's one nation, but the states are sovereign. And why don't people worry about the balance of trade between each state? And so when you expand this principle to foreign countries, the principle is just the same. It's no different between trading with Virginia and Florida or Virginia and Japan. I think the best thing that could ever happen is to just discard the whole balance of trade figures. They're nonsense. They mean nothing. And I remember reading Bastiat early on when I first discovered libertarianism, and he really skewers this whole notion of the balance of trade and that exports are good and imports are bad because of this balance of trade business. And I'm almost certain I recall reading one of his essays where he said, the solution is that you get all these goods there at the American shores to ship overseas, like to Europe, and you mark them all down as exports, like $1 million of exports, whatever the item happens to be. Let's say it's television sets or something, and then you get 50 miles out in the ocean, and then you sink it. You sink all these things. You throw them overboard because if you let them get to their destination, people will then be able to sell them and get the money to export to the United States, which is bad for us. We don't want imports, you see. So by sinking all these things, the ledger is $1 million of exports and no imports. So this is truly beneficial to us. And then following up on your example of the cars, imagine if Japan taxed its citizens to such a large extent that they were offering every single American a free automobile, Toyota, Honda, or whatever. This would be a disaster, Richard. I mean, just think flooding America with not just cheap goods, but free goods. I mean, we couldn't tolerate that type of thing if Japan were going on the attack by shipping everybody a free Honda and a free Toyota, a free 4Runner, a free Lexus. I mean, this would be a disaster. Well, Bastiat, it was so good at skewering these fallacies of trade. Obviously, the point that you're making is totally valid, that if they were shipping these free goods or low-cost goods, this would be a fantastic. It's a bonanza for the American consumer. Now, obviously, an American automobile seller might say, "Well, I'm not sure about this." The competition from free goods. But what we really are talking about is consumers when we talk about an increased standard of living. And if somebody anywhere in the world is going to flood America with free automobiles, That's a fantastic way to increase your standard of living when people are giving you things for free. So I think that if we're ever going to get to the right place in this country, we've got to just burst this whole idea of exports and imports and imbalance of trade and so forth, and just talk in terms of the freedom of the American people to trade. Because ultimately, this is a freedom issue. It's your money. You have a right to buy from whomever you want. That's what private property is all about. You also have a right to sell whatever you want to anybody in the world. And that once we start focusing on that, and then we extend it to the utilitarian cases, this is a way to increase standard of living, then I think we end up shifting the direction of American society toward unilateral free trade.
Well, I think that what you're saying, I now feel sorry for the commentators on Fox News or CNN because they're not able to attain their audiences independent of having to gain revenues and incur costs compared to you and me. We do this LA every week and we give it away for free. How can CNN and Fox survive against our competition? We give our product away for free. So surely we must be on the road to eliminating their ability to economically be viable. But more seriously, I mean, this whole business as you're bringing out, why don't we care about balance of trade between Virginia, Florida, Washington State, and Texas, or anything else? First of all, if we now reduce it to the individual, we also have balance of trade surpluses and balance of trade deficits with everyone we deal with in the marketplace. For example, I'm a professor at the Citadel, and I have a balance of trade surplus with all of my students and their parents. Why? Because they give tuition, and out of which I receive my salary as an employee at the Citadel. The question is, they're buying my labor services as a teacher in the classroom, but what do I buy that either the cadets, the students, or their parents sell? I buy far less of what they have available to sell than what they buy from me. So I have a balance of trade surplus with virtually everyone in that class and their families. On the other hand, when I go to shopping, let's say Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or any of the other major supermarkets which I frequent, I have a balance of trade deficit. I spend money on all of the food items, right? I come with my full cart to the checkout counter in Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, and I'm spending all this money. How much of that money that I spend do the employees or the managers or even the owners of Whole Foods and Trader Joe's spend back on what I have to sell? If we were dealing in barter and I went into Whole Foods or Trader Joe's and said, I need food this week. And if you'll give me a whole carton full of food, I'll give you 20 economics lectures during the week. I have a feeling I'm going to walk out of Whole Foods or Trader Joe's empty-handed. I know it's a shockaroo, but I don't think that there's many employees in either of these stores in my area here who are just dying to hear lectures on free market economics from me. Now, what enables me to do this? The people buying my labor services spend more on what I'm selling than what I buy from them. But that's counterbalanced by the fact that I spend more on what others in the society have for sale than they buy from me, the supermarket example. But my ability to either export my teaching services and earn income from those who purchase them through this institution of higher learning, and my choice to import from the supermarkets more than I export to their employees and their managers balances out. Because at the end of the day, I can't spend more in one direction than I'm getting in the other direction. And at the end of the day, my debits have to equal my credits. The same way as I was explaining about the balance of trade between the United States and Japan. At the end of the day, the balance of payments has to balances. And that's the constraint and the assurance that the system does not go out of some type of irrational balance that destroys one country relative to another.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I want to get your arguments on a point that I raised earlier, mostly to reinforce what I'm saying, but I want to get your individual perspective on this because it is said that okay, free trade is fine, but we need to negotiate with other countries to drop their trade barriers at the same time. And my argument is no, just unilaterally drop them regardless of what the other country does. I'd like your input on that.
Well, I will just give my reply in the instance of an historical example. Great Britain had had heavy agricultural and other trade barriers up till the 1840s. And in 1846, through an act of the British Parliament, uh, virtually all of the agricultural importation barriers, the taxes, the duties, were lowered to zero. And matching that was the elimination of, in very short order, virtually all of the imports on manufacturing and crafts and other types of goods. In other words, in 1846, for all intents and purposes, Great Britain introduced unilateral free trade. They didn't negotiate, they didn't wait for other countries to lower their barriers. Or as the prime minister at that time, who took the front in eliminating those trade restrictions, Sir Robert Peel, said in his final speech before Parliament, because his conservative and Tory agricultural supporters felt betrayed that he was eliminating the trade tariffs on food and threw him out. In his last speech before Parliament, before he stepped down, he said, I hope that Britain follows this path and does not follow the errors of other countries and buys high and sells low. If other countries choose to do so while we are selling high and buying low, we will gain and they will lose. And we hope that our example will set as a model for them to unilaterally follow as well. In fact, if other countries keep up their trade barriers, it means that we're getting all their goods and they're virtually wanting less than they're really worth in return. We're getting all of these bargains. If other countries want to restrict their imports, waste their resources on cost-efficient domestic production of things that they could get less expensively from either the United States or other exporting countries to raise their standards of living, we should not allow their irrationality and stupidity to control our behavior. We should be free, and we should gain the economic benefits from acting free, regardless of what other nations or people are doing.
Okay, on that eloquent insight, we'll wrap things up. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you also enjoyed the conversation. Be sure to subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we strive to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet on a daily basis, 6 days a week. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.